Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about.
I'm curious about
I'm curious about building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about.
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
Resentment is actually, it's like resentment is aged anger is the best way that I can describe resentment. So when anger ages like a good wine, it ain't so good and it becomes resentment. So that's what resentment is. And it's often because you have unresolved anger. Welcome to the Curious Fox podcast. This podcast is for those who challenge the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effy Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Misla. And on today's episode, Effy and I are going to answer your questions.
Yay.
So here is usually where we share some small piece of our lives and go down an insightful or hilarious rabbit hole. But today we're going to skip all that because we want to jump right into your questions and make as much time for questions as possible. Thank you. Really heartfelt thank you to everyone who submitted a question via email, sent us voice memo, or left us voice messages. It was really fun and interesting to sort through all the questions and hear from foxes all around the world.
Definitely. I think we should definitely do more of these episodes, but it was so nice to capture all the questions and listen to all the voices and gather them all together. So let's dive in. Let's start with a voice memo that we received.
I wonder if I should put on hold all relationships or prospect relationships until I have some sort of clarity on what it is that I want. And sometimes I also wonder how to balance emotional responsibility with the autonomy and self-respect.
So there were actually two questions here, right? So let's start with the first one. Should I put my relationship on hold until I'm clear about what I want?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first, let me say, it is absolutely worth the time to reflect on your needs, your desires, your past relationships, your vision for your future, and all of that stuff to determine what kind of partners and partnerships you would like to be in. In fact, Effy and I put together a whole workbook with reflection sheets that you can use to help uncover and clarify important pieces of your intimate, intellectual, sexual, and domestic self. So yes, reflect, discover, explore. And there's some things that can only be discovered via connection with others.
Exactly. Reflection and understanding are great. But at some point, really the only real way to discover and evolve is doing the thing, actually reaching out for relationships and experiencing them. I think the key here is, as you do go on your journey for discovery and evolution, that you are honest with the people that you are dating, that you let them know that you're figuring out what you want and you're discovering and you're learning and you want to reflect and be open-hearted and open-minded. And as you do so, be open-minded and open-hearted and remain curious and constantly check in with yourself. And I think as long as you are open with the people and transparent with the people that you're dating, at some point you kind of have to take the plunge and go on the dates and feel into those relationships, feel into those connections, and then see how you feel and whether your experiences align with some of the discoveries that you've come to through reflection and thought.
And what does that mean? Because we ask, so it sounds like you're saying we should be honest with ourselves and with the people that we're dating, which makes complete sense to me. And I know that sometimes people say, I want a whole person who knows themselves. And sometimes knowing yourself also knows that you're still in discovery mode. So I'm just wondering what that sounds like when you are on a first date or when you're starting to, DM someone on Instagram or OkCupid. What does that sound like? Is it to say, I am in the process of figuring out all the things that light me up, and I'm interested in exploring some of that with you? What does some of that transparency look like?
Yeah, I think if you, for example, if you're not clear on exactly what you want, right? So a version of being clear would be like, I am ready for a family. I'm looking for a partner who's also ready for a family. I'm thinking, I'm thinking nesting. I'm thinking parenting. I'm thinking committing my life from now on till whenever to rear children, right? This is one way of getting very clear. Or another version of being clear would be, I want to be, which is if I want to swing hard the other way, it could be like, I want to be in a relationship and a partnership where we're going to run around the world and discover new parts of the world and travel and not have any commitments and live out of a suitcase or even a backpack. And the priority would be to adventure and exploration, right? That would be being clear. And if you're if you're that clear, you should absolutely state that with the people that you're dating. This is what I'm looking for. The opposite of that would be, I'm not really sure what I want right now. I'm not really sure what I need. I'm not really sure what I want. I'm not really sure what I want my life and relationship to look like. I'm not really sure where I want to go in terms of a relationship. I'm in a discovery mode. I would say the nuanced difference here is authenticity. There's a difference between being avoidant, not wanting to commit, and saying, I don't know what I want from that place, right? You're almost keeping the other person on hold, being at an arm's length, keep them at arm's length. You're sort of not committing. You don't want to, if it comes with like feelings of being engulfed and if you're there, that's a very different place than like, I'm open-minded, I'm open-hearted, I'm learning, I'm exploring, I'm in a dynamic state. And as I do those things, I'm going to report back to you and I will shift from that position. Right? So if you are sort of saying, I don't know what I want to people in an effort to sort of keep them at an arm's length, that's a static place, versus I don't know what I want, but I'm in a journey to find out with an open mind and open heart. Therefore, I'm at a dynamic place, right? Those are very two different states. They may look the same from the outside. The communication might sound the same from the outside, but you need to be in touch with yourself internally and decide, like, where am I? Is this a dynamic state? If you are truly open-minded and open-hearted, and if you are truly curious about the other person and the what are the common places, what you're learning, what resonates and what doesn't resonate, and you're reporting real life and being transparent and being honest with yourself and with them, that's an experiential state that you can go through, right? You might be so lucky that you meet the person that you align with in your first go, right? A little unlikely, but you never know. I think the idea is that you have an intention to connect versus an intention not to connect. And therefore you're just saying, I don't know what I want.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Well, I remember when I started to date after opening up my marriage, I dated a number of people before landing in the relationship that I'm in right now. And each of them really was with the intention of being in exploring that particular partnership. Each one revealed in itself something that I realized, like in the first one, I realized it was much more sexual energy and we weren't spending a lot more enough time getting to know each other. And that felt out of balance for me. And so then I shifted. And then the next one was much more intellectual and conversational and not as sexual. So I was like, okay, then that needed to balance. And the other one I realized I was like trying to be in girlfriend mode and that person wasn't there for that. And I was like, oh, okay, now I know this about myself. So frankly, by the time that I met my current partner, in the beginning, like the first few exchanges between us, I was like, here's what I know. I know how to be a partner. I know how to be a wife. And that's like where I want to be at. I know that I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And like, here's what I don't know. And that information was like gathered via field research, if you will.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I would also say, sometimes when we're looking for a partner, when we're looking for a relationship, that we get too focused on the other side of things. So we get too focused on the relationship, we get too focused on the other person. I would say spending some time figuring out yourself in a way that you are aligned and that you understand your thriving state, which is going to be your clue, right? So the other people are going to be whatever they're going to be. You're going to have very little control over them. What you will have is yourself, an insight to yourself and a connection to yourself. And you know that a relationship will work for you where it will contribute and nurture and sustain your thriving state as much as possible, right? This is what we say about relationship by design. You design a relationship so that it can sustain and nurture your thriving state. Most of us don't have access to an insight to our thriving state. What does it feel like? What are the conditions that get us there? What gets in the way? and figuring that out and being aligned with your thriving state, so that when you meet somebody, when you embark on a relationship, when you are exploring a connection, you can say, oh, is this igniting my thriving state? Is this sustaining my thriving state? Do I find myself connecting to that higher self? And I think that is I think that's a worthwhile reflection. To really like work that muscle of knowing, oh, here's what it looks like when I'm thriving. Here's what it feels like. So that when you are in that state, you can say, oh yeah, like that person or this relationship or these people or these relationships really nurture that state. Right. And one other thing that I would add, since you're working on that skill, by the way, these are all muscles. These are all emotional, intellectual, insightful reflection muscles. Also working on the skill and the internal connection to know when something feels good or not, right? It's sometimes something that we don't really have a connection to. It's one of the core reasons why we cross our own boundaries, or we're unable to state our boundaries in the first place, because we've lost touch with what feels good or not. Sometimes, especially at the beginning of the relationship, we are so concerned with the other person, how the other person is feeling, how they're perceiving you, where the relationship is going. Do they like you, or do you feel that you like them? And we sort of get so caught up in that. We get disconnected from ourselves. I think really working that muscle so that you can remain both connected with yourself and still have an open connection to the other person can help you. It's like that's the work worth doing before you start dating, rather than thinking about all the different values and all the different aspects of the other person.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I do think that there is a disconnect there. And it also makes me think about the podcast episode that we just recorded. So if you haven't heard the episode right before this, where we talk about potential and possibility and being aware of not falling in love with potential and possibility, that's something to listen to too, to help with the answer to this question, that as you're exploring different relationships and you're starting to feel what feels good for you, recognize, is it this real person who is actually in front of me, the connection with this person, or is the potential of being in a relationship and we may have babies together, we're going to travel the world together, or like if it is the potential and possibility that feels good, just be mindful that that's a little bit of a red flag. And you know, could you thrive in this current state as is and be really happy? Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I also heard you talking about ensuring that you and yourself, you're at a thriving state. Can you talk a little bit more about that, around like, what do you need to do to ensure that outside of partnership, you feel strong, you feel whole?
If you're not dating to get clear, if you've taken a pause to get clear about things, I suggest that you use that time to also, and maybe more so, on strengthening all the things outside the relationship. That's friends and family and community and purpose and passion. All those things, those will allow you to create safety and security and stability in multiple areas of your life, rather than having you focus on needing that from a romantic partnership or a romantic relationship, so that you can look at a relationship as a place to thrive rather than a place to survive. And I think that's when we struggle, when we look at a relationship as a part of our survival system. And then that's when we're triggering attachment stuff, right? The whole attachment stuff, which we've done multiple episodes on, and we will continue to talk about because it's so important. That attachment struggles are triggered when we are in a survival state. So if we strengthen everything else around us, if we make sure that we feel safe and stable and secure in all the other areas of our lives, then we might not look for that within the relationship. Then you're in that juicy, delicious, wonderful place of thriving and growing and evolving.
I love that. Yeah. So it feels like the answer to this question is, don't go on hold, like explore. So either explore yourself, explore your friends, family, community, purpose, passion, and be in that exploration. And when you feel like it's time to be in partnership, you will explore that, and or explore both and explore who you are through your connection with other people, as long as you're doing that, with transparency. So the answer is both. Take time to know yourself, build your thriving self outside of partnership. And we can in our Instagram stories, after we post this podcast, we can put a link to the workbook that Effy and I created, based on the relationship by design concepts of know thyself. And then date honestly, date mindfully in a way that you want to learn more about what you want in relationships to build intimacy with others. So that was just part one. There's a part two to the question, which was, how do I balance emotional responsibility with autonomy and self-respect?
Short question, but like so much in there, so much to unpack. Yeah. And I have to admit, like, we had to ponder on this. Like, we had to really ponder what this person means about emotional responsibility, as opposed to balancing that out with autonomy and self-respect. And I think where we landed is that this idea of emotional responsibility is how you feel about the other person's emotional state, right? Like, you and your partner or partners, how much do you owe them to support their emotional well-being and emotional state? And I think there are a few cues that I would suggest. Like, there's some emotional cues that you can look out for that can tell you, oh, I think I am more involved with the other person's well-being than myself, that I am feeling like I'm losing my sense of autonomy and my self-respect because I'm sort of crossed the line to the other side and I'm too aligned, too engulfed, too enmeshed with the other person. The emotional cues that I suggest are resentment. If you're feeling resentment, that's definitely a pause, right? Resentment is actually, it's like resentment is aged anger is the best way that I can describe resentment. So when anger ages like a good wine, it ain't so good and it becomes resentment. So that's what resentment is. And it's often because you have unresolved anger, right? So if you cross that line within yourself, within the context too many times, and you're pissed essentially, and you don't deal with it.
Yeah.
Right? That builds resentment. That's a cue.
And we talk about that when we did the podcast episode around caregiving and how we often put ourselves in situations where we want to care for others. We want to care for our partners. We are the person who asks, what can we do? And we want to serve, and acts of service is a big part of the way that we show love. And at some point, some mysterious line gets crossed in our minds where something that felt like it was given from our spirit and our generosity now comes something that we feel resentful around or we feel obliged to do. And just being able to pick up on that at what point are you being emotionally supportive, and then it switches in your mind to a frustration that they don't have self-respect or autonomy, or that you are not demonstrating those values because of this emotional enmeshment that you have with each other.
Right. Exactly. So that's kind of one cue. I would say the other emotional cue to watch out for is a sense of obligation.
Yeah.
So the way to kind of, I guess, figure out if you're feeling a sense of obligation is to watch out for like accompanying feelings like guilt. Right. So to find out if you feel obliged for something, look for signs of guilt. Like, ask yourself, what if I don't do this? If you then feel guilt, that's your cue that you probably feel obliged. Like, and those are just cues. Everyone's built differently. So these are like cues and clues for you to kind of do some emotional auditing. And if you are operating from a place of obligation with a punishment of guilt, that's also a sign that you may have crossed the line. That you may be taking on more than you are prepared to, you're willing to, you're able to in that moment. That might also be like, okay, this is probably beyond what is your emotional responsibility. And then the third thing is something that we mentioned a couple of times, is really about this idea of enmeshment, right? We use this term enmeshment. Enmeshment is essentially when the way that I explain it in sessions always is like when you lose sight of where you end and the other person begins, which can sound a little esoteric. Like a good practical way to think about it is when how you feel is how I feel. Right. So your emotional state has a direct impact on my emotional state that in a way that I have no control over. And that I want to control it because that's the only way that I can be regulated.
Right.
So if you're angry, I can't tolerate your anger. It makes me upset or it makes me sad. It makes me feel guilty that I can't separate my set of emotions from your set of emotions.
That resonates with me because I'm thinking about things that when I think about a feeling that I may in my mind think that I am creating in the other person, then I think about how do I change my own behavior to possibly prevent them from feeling what they're going to feel. So what I mean by that is if I'm thinking to myself, oh, I really want to take tonight just to myself. I have felt like I am being consumed by all of the people around me or my tasks or my work or whatever, and I need tonight off. And I think to myself, oh, but whomever I'm supposed to spend time with tonight, be it my partners or my daughter, they might feel disappointed. Then I will think, okay, what can I do to curb their disappointment? Do I cancel on myself? Do I say I'm going to cancel with them, but immediately then suggest some sort of more extravagant makeup night so that they feel better? Like I immediately can start to think about how my feelings and my needs will trigger them negatively and then my responsibility to navigate that on their behalf.
Exactly. So just like we kind of gave clues around like resentment is like aged anger, obligations has a side of guilt. The ways to figure out enmeshment or to notice enmeshment is manipulation. Like, have you started to manipulate the situation or have you skipped or jumped into problem solving?
Yep.
So if you have noticed those things, either you might have crossed that line now into enmeshment, right? So those are like just, again, cues and clues to get you to do some emotional auditing to see where you are.
It's always fascinating to me in the midst of these podcasts where I'm like, check. And I'm like, oh, like, oh, more work to do.
But isn't it amazing that we have these like resources and clues and insight? I mean, that's what I think. And by the way, knowing these things doesn't mean you get them right. I mean, same here. Like in me, as I explain these things, I'm like, check. Today, just in one day, I've done these things. Like I have noticed aged anger. I've done things because I know that if I don't do them, I'm going to feel guilty. I've jumped into problem solving because I wanted to control the other person's emotions because I don't want to feel bad. Like in a single day, I've done these with people I'm in a relationship with. So yes, like everybody's on this. Like listeners, Foxes, you are not alone. At least two people here that is going, yep, that's my regular day. So yeah, absolutely. I think, that's the same.
Yeah.
And then let's give some help to people, right? So if you're listening to this and you're feeling like these resonate with you and you've done what we just said, which is check. Yeah, that's where I am. What can you do, right? How can you get in the way? How can you make sure that you get that balance of emotional responsibility with autonomy and self-respect? Communication. Yes, but also let's talk about how. So ask before you act would be my rule of thumb for you. Ask questions from a gentle curiosity about what the other person needs in that moment rather than assume, right? So you can ask questions like, would you like me to support you? Would you like me to listen? Would you like me to help you problem solve? Right? So get some input from the other person and then check in with yourself to see what's available, right? Once you ask, listen to what they have to say as a request, not a demand, and check in with yourself to say, okay, can I fulfill those things, right? How can I support you? You know, if somebody says, you can support me by being at my bedside and listen to every word I say for the next week, right? You might not be like, okay, I hear you. I'm not available for that. I have a life, which is very real, right? And then you can say, okay, well, I might not be able to do it continuously for the next week, but how about, we take this evening, we turn our phones off, we get cozy, and, you tell me what's on your mind, and I'll listen to everything that you have to say, right? So once you ask these questions, whatever you hear them as requests, and then check in with yourself to see what's available in me to fulfill this, and then start from there.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it's about getting clear with yourself. What is your responsibility and what belongs to the other person? And if you believe that you don't have good boundaries around this, then ask somebody who has really good and strong boundaries, or find a therapist or a coach to support you. There are folks who are really good role models of this. And I am constantly in the practice of this. And what I heard you saying, Effy, before is figure out for yourself what makes sense, look for the internal clues, and then start to figure out what belongs to you, what belongs to the other person. How do you build some boundaries, and how do you get more support around that? Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And the old adage, thanks to the airlines, put on your own mask before helping others. You need to make sure that you take care of yourself emotionally, that you're emotionally regulated in a way that you have excess. And once you have extra, when you have excess, when you have more available than that you need for yourself, then you use that to support others.
Yep. So let's listen to another question, this time from our podcast hotline.
Hi there. I've been married to my wife for 24 years, and about 3 years ago, we opened the relationship, and it's been generally really wonderful. I ended up getting much closer to a girlfriend than I initially expected. And 14 months later, in pandemic life, things were just too overwhelming and complicated for that to continue. And I had to break up with her, with the girlfriend. And we both want to ultimately establish a friendship. And we both feel very good about the ability to do that. And my wife feels confident that we could and should as well, because she really does like this person as a friend and a person. My question is, how do you balance grieving and loss, which I'm going through currently, with how and when to try to reestablish connection and rebuild a friendship?
Wow. So when I hear this question, one of the first things that jump out of me is that how beautiful that everyone is able to talk about the relationship transition and have the intention to be connected to one another one way or another. So, it's beautiful, right? And that's kind of what is the ideal of polyamory or non-monogamy, or these sort of open relationships where you can transition from one type of relationship to another and at least remain civil or maintain relationships and connections. And that's kind of the ideal. That's the ninja level stuff, and it's not available for everyone. It's just nice to hear when it works, and even people feel like they have to shift priorities or show up for somebody else and transition out of a relationship, they can still connect it and they have good intentions. So I find that to be beautiful.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what I love about this too is that it illustrates that relationships are not in a stagnant state, even when moving into poly or open relationships. I think that sometimes we think about moving into open and then you are there. And this shows that even within that, there's like opening and closing and transforming and moving and evolving and figuring out what consistently works within the relationship. How do you continue to design the relationships with your partners, with those around you, so that you continue to feel like you're thriving? And when you start to feel like we are no longer thriving, to realize that you have the ability then to make adjustments within your relationship with transparency, with kindness, so that you can try to find a state of thriving and do the work around that. So I love that. I love it. I love it.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And then now to the question of how and when to try to reestablish connection and how to live the relationship out in its new dynamic in social circles, which I think is also a noble intention to sort of say, okay, we are going to maintain this and we're going to keep it in the context of our social lives, and we're going to make sure that everybody feels that they're connected. And what does that look like? So I think, again, great intentions. I would say the important thing to understand is people grieve differently. Grieving is a very personal, intimate experience. And it takes people different ways to do it. Some people need to cry and howl and really, get it out of them and get really messy and down. And some people go inside and they become contemplative and sort of do it differently. Some people, their grieving looks like partying hard, right? Some people grieving looks like long walks in nature and solitude. So it looks different for different people. So just figuring out what grieving looks like for you, what you need to grieve, what do you need to really process the loss, what rituals do you need, what space do you need, what does it look like, what does it feel like, right? So really kind of understand that, I think is important. And then communicate that to other people. Right? Like, this is what I need. I need some time on my own, or I need to go out and like party, because that's just how I'm going to grieve. I'm just going to shift my mind to something else and, go into extra connection mode. Right. So really figuring out what that looks like for you. And I think if you need that disconnection, if you need a period of disconnection to do the grieving, if that's what your grieving looks like, if that's how you process loss, it might not feel so disingenuous as everybody agrees to what grieving process looks like for them, right? So if you can communicate about not communicating and say, this is what it takes for me to get over this, right? You can agree on how and when to break the silence. You can maybe have a scheduled check-in, right? Or if one person is more tender than the other, maybe they can be the one that reaches out when they're ready. Right. So you can have an initial connection that is about like, what is this grieving period going to look like, and agree so that it doesn't feel so disingenuous. Right. You can then communicate that to your social circle as well. So we're going through a relationship transition. We're taking some time apart so we can metabolize it. In the meantime, we're just going to like give each other as much space as possible. You don't need to be awkward around us. Please invite whomever you're going to invite to whatever you want, and we'll handle it ourselves, right? You either want to show up or you don't want to show up. And when you show up in the place, you want to say hello, you don't want to say hello. Like, just agree on that up front. And then you just let it, just let it happen. If space is what's required, then that's fine. And if it means that you keep some distance during this time, actually, this is kind of a good time to be keeping your distance anyway, then so be it.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate how hard this is, because not only is this decision that you've made with your wife and with your former partner to really invest some more energy in your primary partnership, it also just means that, to your point, feelings are hurt and to different degrees of that, and figuring out what you need and what they need. And some of that's going to take trial and error. Some of it you may feel like, I need space. And then you realize that actually, no, now that leaves me just with all of this room to continue to think about them. And so I want more regular check-ins. And so allowing some evolution in whatever the request is, and asking your wife and your former partner what they need as well. And realizing that is going to continue to change, so that maybe then you get to a place where there's friendship and you're spending some more time in a friendship way with your former partner, and you realize there's still sexual energy and chemistry there, and that becomes, how do you navigate that? And so now you want to have that conversation with them, and then you want to go back and have that conversation with your wife, or maybe then there's jealousy involved. And I guess the point is that there's going to continue to be things that will come up in this process, and that this process that Effy is, or rather the strategy that Effy is describing out of, everyone gets clear about what they need and want. Everyone communicates it. Everyone just tries to be as gentle as possible with themselves and others along the way. The only thing I would add here, particularly as it relates to social circles, is not to force any expectations that don't need to be there. That if there is a particular thing that you want to go to or don't want to go to, if there is a particular, friend that you want to stay connected with or don't, like, allow what looks like thriving for you to lead. Versus what you should do, or will make people more let everyone, to the previous question, everyone needs to manage their own feelings. So as long as you're honest with your feelings and they are with their own, let's allow enough autonomy for people to navigate their own feelings without feeling obliged or guilty or resentful or all those other terms, right? In order to, or meshed in what their feelings are. And it sounds like you guys are doing a really great job of that so far.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I mean, it's like it's a beautiful story. Just a quick story. In my previous relationships, I actually facilitated a conscious uncoupling between two partners of mine, and it was a party. I threw them a party. It was where they kind of announced to their friends that they're no longer connected to each other romantically, and that they were uncoupling, and that it was and how they want things to be managed from there on. It was beautiful. We partied, we hugged, and we were sad for a little bit, and then they kind of made speeches and told everybody what they like about the other person and why they don't think that the relationship why they think the relationship is going to transition, and kind of said to people, and this is how we like to be treated during this time. Like, you can support us this way. Don't worry about this. It was beautifully handled, and I love it when I hear stories like this, when people are like, look, we're people, we respect each other, we love each other, relationships transform and transition. We're just going to manage it and be kind and compassionate and onwards, And I think the thing that I would leave you with, which I think is the key here, is that what feels disingenuous. I think things only feel disingenuous when there isn't transparency, right? So if you need space, ask for space. If you need connection, ask for connection. If you can get transparent, whatever it is that you need won't feel disingenuous. It'll be quite the opposite. It'll be very authentic. And then hopefully the other person or the other people can respect that.
And the human side of it is it'll be bumpy along the way. Mm-hmm. And again, you guys are doing, it sounds like a really good job of continuing to check in with yourself around that and talking to each other.
Nice.
Speaking of communication, we got a question via our email at listening at We Are Curious Foxes. And so I'm going to read out that question for us.
I like how we're storming through these as well, because we're just like, let's get all the questions in. So yeah, we're going to get all the questions in. There are so many.
It's true. So the question, what is the most compassionate and effective approach for discussing hypocrisy? What happens when an individual in a relationship where one partner talks one way and acts another? So for example, a partner states that age means nothing to them, but then they used ageist comments. Or another example, a partner seems to appreciate their lover's feminist views, but complains as equally when it is not put into action. So when their male partner doesn't seem to be tough enough or decisive enough or manly enough.
Wow. Tricky one. Let's look at this in a couple of ways, right? So this is definitely tricky, though it might not be intentional. So let's say if intentional, like if this is happening intentionally, if they're saying one thing and doing something else and it's a pattern and it seems intentional, then I would say we are venturing in the territory of gaslighting, and that is somewhat of a toxic dynamic. And I would say, take care of yourself. This might not be the best relationship dynamic for you. Like gaslighting is like one of the key indicators for toxic relationships. However, I'd like to make a charitable assumption that they are not aware of what's going on, that it is not intentional. And if that's the case, let's say that is the case. There are a few reasons why this might be happening, right? And it's worth thinking about why these things might be happening. One of the reasons that I can think of is that they might not be ready to live up to their values, right? And they might not be ready to do what it takes to actually live out their values. So a great example would be that if you're a man, it would take effort to be a true feminist, right? You'd have to give up space, you'd have to give up power, you'd have to make room, you'd have to maybe let go of things that mean valuable to you. So even though you might subscribe to the ideals, you might not be ready to do the things that really enact your ideals, right? So when sometimes when push comes to shove, they might not be ready to live their values, their beliefs, or ideals, right? That might be one of the reasons. The other way to think about it is that often people report being intellectually ready for something, but not necessarily emotionally there. So a great example that we always come across here is that you might be intellectually ready for your partner to date somebody else, then have a full-on meltdown emotionally when your partner actually goes on a date.
Yes, that completely resonates with me. Absolutely. And to your point, I think when I as our podcast audience will know know this story, probably know my story as much as their own. I introduced open relationship into my relationship, and then certainly the way in which it happened via some infidelity, and that was challenging. When it started to actually happen and we had gone through the work of clearing up and then she was going on dates and spending time out, I really struggled. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was ready and I meant it. When I said I wanted to do this, that was true for me. And it really did feel different in practice. Mm-hmm. And so it was not a matter of intention. I did want it. And then the reality of it was very different. And that could be the case potentially in this where, you have these feminist ideals of, yes, I want to be equal to my male partner. And then maybe then at some point she feels like, oh, wait a minute. Some of those narratives around what a man should be or what, I want to, it doesn't matter what age the person is that I'm dating, younger, older, we're all people. And yet that maybe in practice, she's starting to feel something different. And so that could be the reality that meant that was very true for her. And in practice, she's realizing that she wants some different things.
For sure. Yeah. So that could be one of the reasons. Another reason why they might be showing out that way is good old fashioned ignorance. It's not pretty, but it might be one of the reasons. They may say they're not ageist or age doesn't matter, but they might not really know what that means. Or they might say they're feminist, but they might not really understand what that looks like in the world. So it could just be they think they understand and what it looks like, but they just don't. It's not pretty, it's not nice, but that might be one of the reasons. Mm-hmm. Another reason could be a lack of self-awareness or privilege, right? It's hard to notice prejudice when you are privileged, They might not have awareness of how they're showing up. A great example, since we're talking about, the examples were given as ageism and feminism. Just last weekend, I was talking to a friend of mine. She's beautiful and smart and successful. And we were talking about inequality in the workplace. And she has her own business and I have my own business. And we have to pitch to other people. And she was sort of saying how she feels like she's never lost a pitch because she's a woman, and she was sort of challenging some of the feminist rhetoric. And I had to remind her that she is a white, beautiful, well-presenting, well-educated woman that presents in a very certain way, and that she does not necessarily represent the entire of the female experience, right? So for her, it was difficult to wrap her head around what might be a broader female experience or a woman's experience, because her particular experience, because she came from privilege, that she didn't even realize some of the privileges she comes from, just sort of made her think that maybe feminism was on the extreme side. Mm-hmm. So that's just the lack of self-awareness, or, in her case, it was definitely privilege.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Another reason, there's so many reasons why this might be happening, is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance means when you believe or think of something a certain way and then you act a different way, right? So a lot of the time we think of people who act against their own interest are in some sort of cognitive dissonance. They say something and they do something else. It's very common. I experience it on a personal level. I actually... in this weird, bizarre version of my life right now, I live in the countryside somewhat, and there are like cows and chickens and all sorts of animal goats around me, and I feel very strongly about how they're taken care of. And they're well fed, they're kept clean, they get as much space as possible. If they're going to get transported from place to place, that they are safe and they feel comfortable, all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I eat these animals on regular basis. I get very particular about how they're going to get transported to the butcher who's going to kill them so I can eat them. But at the end of the day, I eat them, right? So that is a type of cognitive dissonance, right? I think, we should be really nice to animals, and then I go and eat them, right? So that's what might be going on. Like in their head, they might be feeling like, they're a staunch feminist, or that, ageism is bad. But when it actually comes to action, they act against it. So it sounds like a type of cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
I think in all of these cases, and I can go on, I can come up with reasons why this might be happening. I think in all these cases, communication is what might move the needle here. So it might be worth just speaking to them and speaking to your experience as much as you can and be curious about their take on it. So communication that goes along the lines of, when I notice this, when I observe this, when I hear this, or when I hear you say, you know, whatever feels ageist and whatever feels as if it's promoting toxic masculinity, it feels against your values of this and this and this. I'm curious about your experience. I'm wondering what you're experiencing. And then listen to see if they can actually try to resolve it in themselves and give you some clues to why it might be showing up that way.
Yeah. First of all, I love that strategy of, I notice this and it feels like it's against your values of that. I'm wondering what your experience of that is. And before, honestly, even you have that conversation, my question is, I'd love for you to explore what their hypocrisy triggers in you. So do you have values around justice or self-reflection or honesty that you feel like their behavior is butting against? Like, why does their behavior or their experience with another partner bother you? Does it butt against your impression of them and make you think about your own integrity for being with them? I encourage you to explore why it bothers you and what that discomfort is trying to tell you about you. So by focusing on what you can do, your choices, your behaviors, and your options, you may be able to focus less on their words and their behaviors and more on what you need to do to be in alignment and to thrive.
I love that. This may not get resolved. You know, they may carry on living in their cognitive dissonance or whatever it is. And ultimately, you are going to decide what you're going to do. So I love that. Yeah, I love that. Best of luck. Love those questions.
I know. And we had so many questions. We only got to 3. We will do more episodes like this where we will answer more questions. And we would love for you to submit more questions because it provided really good food for thought for us and exploration as we were thinking about which questions to answer and what our answers would be. And so let's keep doing this.
Yeah. And if you would like us to answer your question on a future episode, you can share questions by a couple of ways. You can share them with us by taking a voice memo on your phone and emailing to us at listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com. That's listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com. Or you can go old-fashioned way and you can record a question by calling the show. And our number is 201-870-0063. That's 201-870-0063. By the way, you can find these contact details on our show notes as well.
Yeah. And we have been thinking about the fact that because we have all these questions, we should actually start posting them on our Facebook, on our Instagram, and have more opportunities and more places for people to engage with each other in some of these Q&As. And so if you're interested in finding those and finding us on social media, then you can find us by looking at We Are Curious Foxes on Instagram, on Facebook. You should join those platforms, follow us so that you can get access to all of this content as well as some behind the scenes of our podcast process. If you want even more behind the scenes than that, then we encourage you to go onto Patreon. You can find us again at We Are Curious Foxes. If you support us on Patreon, you get some bonus episodes that are just for you. You get the opportunity to ask our upcoming guests questions. You get access to our archive of all of the videos of our online and in-person events. We are in the process of getting some swag, some merchandise together that you will get some free stuff. You'll get discounts to stuff. And so go onto Patreon. That is where you can find podcast, written things, engagement, Ask Me Anythings with Effy, and so much more.
Yeah, so much more. This episode is produced and edited by the warm and thoughtful Nina Pollock. Our intro music is composed by Dave Saha. We are, as always, so grateful for their work. And we are also grateful for you for listening. As always, stay curious, friends.
Curious Fox Podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.